Hi, and welcome to Check Your Thread, a podcast about sewing more sustainably. My name's Zoe, and I'm obsessed with sewing. I've been blogging about it for over 13 years and am the creator and host of the popular handmade wardrobe challenge, Me Made May. But like many people, I've become increasingly concerned about the climate crisis and the way my lifestyle contributes to it. So in this podcast, I'll be nerding out about making clothes whilst exploring how to minimise the negative impact that it may have. I really hope you'll join me on this journey. Hello, wonderful listeners. How are you doing? Amazingly well, I hope. I've been very busy over the last week, but also pretty productive, so I'm feeling pretty good all in all. So I hope your creative projects are going to plan. This week, with the help of friend of the podcast, Julia Hinks, I finally stitched together my first successful knitted garment. It's a super chunky knit rust-coloured cardigan made using wool and a pattern by We Are Knitters. So it was a kit that I bought last year when they had a discount on, and it's taken me an age to get to the finished garment point, but it's done and it's so cozy! So that's very exciting. I've also finished up yet another dungarees project. This pair is made by piecing scraps and leftovers of denim all patchwork together. They look pretty wild and very 90s, and when I get some photos taken to share, I'll talk about them more because they were inspired by some of the conversations I had for this very podcast. Sustainability-wise, I have little to report, really. I got a tiny bit further with my drafty front door issue. I got a recommendation of someone to contact who might be able to take on the job. I've messaged them, but I haven't heard back yet. Also, I've continued to be committed to the whole meal plan and careful food shopping thing. It's been going okay, but when we did our end of the month tot-up last week, despite all the batch cooking and food prep for lunches and everything, we still ended up spending the same amount on food that we did last year, making no inroads at all towards our goal of spending £200 less a month on food. Food prices have risen dramatically lately, so I know it's not entirely our fault that we didn't meet our goal, but it's disappointing nevertheless. If anyone has any ideas of how to get food bills down, I'm all ears. But what never disappoints is seeing amazing listeners sign up to support the podcast via Patreon. This week, I get to thank two lovely new patrons. Thank you so much to Samantha and Emma. They have signed up to support Check Your Thread each month and help make it viable for me to make new ad-free episodes each week. If you enjoy listening and feel you are able to contribute a monthly amount of your choosing, please find the link in the show notes or on the website checkyourthread.com or by going to patreon.com/checkyourthread. Okay, today's episode. Buoyed by the thrill of messing with the format for last week's episode, this one is also something a bit different. I've been working on a mini-series of solo episodes on a topic that I am fascinated by, the Make, Do, Amend campaign of the 1940s. The phrase make, do, amend is often used today to refer to the ethos of repairing something over throwing it away. However, I thought it'd be interesting to look into the original source of the term and what the Make, Do, Amend campaign actually was. This episode investigates the historical and social context of the campaign, along with the clothes rationing scheme that made Make, Do, Amend so essential. I hope you find this topic as interesting as I do. If not, tune in again in a few weeks' time. All right, enjoy. Make, Do, Amend is a phrase often used to refer to the ethos of repairing something over throwing it away. Sometimes it's used in direct reference to the campaign that took place in the early 1940s during the Second World War, when materials were scarce and repair was essential. But as time passes and we move further away from that era, it often gets used more generally, a phrase to suggest that there's a wider reason, movement or philosophy behind an act of repair. Both these uses and functions of the phrase are valid in my book, but I thought it'd be interesting to look into the original source of the term. The Make, Do, Amend and the Dig for Victory campaigns that occurred during the Second World War really fascinate me. Generationally, I don't feel a great separation from those times. I knew and loved people who lived through them. My grandparents were all in their late 20s during the Second World War. One of my grandmothers was in the reserved occupations. She was a garment worker making coats for the military. The other was in the Land Army, which was a group of women drafted to provide agricultural labour to keep up food production when many regular farm labourers had left to go overseas. But unfortunately, my interest in that period and the realities of those campaigns developed after I was able to talk to my grandparents about it. And my mum said that when she was growing up in the 50s and 60s, she always felt a sense that it was a period that the generation above her wanted to put behind them, so she never felt comfortable asking them about it. So I decided to find out what I can about the MDAM campaigns from the sources available to me now. So this first episode of the mini-series is about the history of the campaign, what it was, how it worked, and putting it into context in relation to life at the time. So it has to be acknowledged that I'm focusing on the realities of the Second World War in the UK specifically. I'd love to know more about the experiences of citizens of other nations during that time and about any official or unofficial campaigns for helping regular people repair and make do. However, sadly, I don't have time for that amount of research. If anyone knows a lot about the equivalent period in a different country and would like to talk about it on the podcast, please get in touch. I hope that this episode will be of interest even if you aren't from the UK. I think that it's a really valuable endeavour to look back at the lives of people from previous generations and think about what they went through, wherever they lived. Right, let's crack on. So what would life have been like for regular people living through the Second World War? Because of the impact that the war had on supplies of materials and power, the Second World War brought about a level of government intervention into everyday life that was unprecedented at the time and would be barely imaginable today. Almost as soon as the Second World War broke out in September 1939, rationing started up in the UK. The term rationing refers to the allowance of particular materials and products that members of the population were allowed to buy. Every person or household was issued with a physical booklet that would record the purchasing of these items to make sure that everyone kept within their allotted allowance. Petrol for private vehicles was the first thing to be rationed, and as the war continued, more materials and products were added to the rationing scheme, and the rations allocated would also decrease. Rationing was required because many of the materials that would have been made into items available for civilian use previously were diverted to make munitions and other supplies for the war effort. Plus, other items were in short supply as the war went on due to the disruption of imports because of sea blockades and the bombing of ships containing goods. So petrol for private cars was limited to a small amount at the start of the war in 1939, and even those allowances stopped altogether in 1942. However, private car and motorcycle use was far less common then than it is today. What hit everyone in the population was the introduction of food rationing in 1940. Then, a year later, clothes rationing was introduced. That ran in some form for 8 years until 1949, 4 years after the end of the war, and incidentally 1 year before my parents were born. That shows the extent of the depletion of materials. About 1/4 of the British population were entitled to wear some kind of uniform during the Second World War. That included the entire armed forces, of course, and also the women's auxiliary forces and numerous voluntary services and organisations that were set up to support the war effort and keep the population safe. The need for all those uniforms created an incredible demand on the UK textiles and clothing industries. All the raw materials, factory space and labour, including my nan, that were required to produce them, and other textiles items like parachutes used in the war effort, had to be diverted away from civilian clothing production. Clothing rationing, along with food rationing, was a big deal because it affected everybody and it made life really difficult for most people. I sometimes think about how it must have felt with the ongoing threat of war, fear of bombings, particularly in the cities, news about casualties both abroad and in the UK, perhaps having loved ones away fighting, and the massive uncertainties about the future. And on top of that, having to figure out daily how you were going to keep your family sufficiently fed and clothed. The clothing rationing scheme worked by allocating each type of garment a points value, which varied according to how much material and labour went into its manufacture. At the start of the scheme, every adult was allotted 66 coupons to last 1 year. Those coupons would be handed over along with your money when you went shopping. Here's some examples of the coupons required for various items. A dress required 11 coupons, 2 for a pair of stockings, and 8 for a man's shirt or pair of trousers. A lined overcoat required a comparatively whopping 18 coupons. Women's shoes required 5 and men's 7. Even some household textile items had an allotted coupon value, as did fabric for home sewing. Because children grow and need new clothes more frequently, children's clothes had a lower coupon value, and new mothers were given 50 coupons to clothe their baby. Coupons were even needed for school uniforms, which could be a particular problem as many schools did not relax their rules on uniform during wartime. The allocation of coupons shrank as the war progressed, making decisions about what to buy and what to do without even more difficult. The allocation of coupons was at its lowest from September 1945 to April 1946, when only 24 coupons were issued for the 8-month period, effectively allowing the shopper only 3 coupons per month. Throughout the war, special provisions were made for some people, including manual workers, civilian uniform wearers, diplomats, and theatrical performers. Even buying second-hand clothing above a set price would have required coupons, albeit far fewer. Of course, life was even more tricky for families on low incomes and or with a lot of children. Aside from the complexities and difficulties brought by the rationing system, clothing prices also rose during the war due to the restrictions. All similar types of clothing were issued with the same value of coupons regardless of quality, so wealthier people could afford better quality clothing that would last longer. The availability of mass-produced clothing became increasingly limited, and in 1942 a range of standardised clothing became available called utility clothing. Utility clothing ranges were sponsored by the Board of Trade and had to meet tight regulations in relation to the amount of fabric and materials required to produce each item. The number of styles available was restricted for efficiency and led to changes in clothing manufacture that were adopted in post-war garment production also. Leading fashion designers of the day were commissioned to design them. However, the parameters that they worked to were strict. For example, a dress could have no more than 2 pockets, 5 buttons and 4 metres of stitching in each. Men's suits had to be single-breasted with restricted lapel width, and turn-ups on trousers were banned to conserve fabric. As unsexy as government-sanctioned clothing sounds, utility clothing provided individuals and families on lower incomes access to decent quality clothing at a fair price, and therefore got better value from their limited coupons. The government produced posters and leaflets offering advice about the complex rationing system. People were encouraged to plan any purchases carefully so they'd leave themselves enough coupons for the coming seasons. Even with careful planning, it became clear that there needed to be focus on finding clever additional ways to meet people's clothing and household needs. One solution came in the form of swap shops or clothing exchanges. Often organised through the Women's Voluntary Service, these were set up to exchange clothing items, particularly things that children had outgrown. Families were encouraged to bring outgrown children's clothes in and were awarded a number of points to be exchanged for more useful items. And as the scarcity of materials really began to kick in during the second year of clothes rationing, it began to be officially acknowledged that more needed to be done to keep the population suitably clothed. The Women's Group on Public Welfare was a philanthropic women's organisation founded in the late 1930s, and they focused on the improvement of social conditions by investigating perceived problems and publishing reports about them. In 1942, they made the recommendation that a nationwide campaign be created to encourage citizens to make the most of clothing and textiles that they already owned. This campaign became known as the Make, Do, Amend campaign. It was given official support by the autumn of 1942 and launched by the Board of Trade in 1943. Its intention was to help households get the very last ounce of use from clothing and household items. This was to be done by encouraging and teaching people to properly care for, repair, reuse and reimagine their existing clothes. The campaign included films, posters, booklets and instructional leaflets, and they tried to alleviate the population's concerns or doubt with a deliberately playful and chipper tone. They also attempted to inspire ingenuity and creativity. For example, the Ministry of Information produced a newsreel that would have been played at the beginning of a film, entitled Make, Do and Mend, that featured a glum-looking family bemoaning their lack of rations. In the film, the family is then visited by their animated old clothing, including the mother's wedding dress, which in turn suggest ways that they could be turned into a new garment for each member of the family. As well as ideas for reimagining existing garments, the campaign shared tips on garment construction to help bring these ideas to actual fruition. There was information on how best to store clothes to prevent damage, including from moths, how to launder different fibres to secure their longevity, and how to tackle stains. Patching and darning techniques for tackling different types of rips and holes, as well as how to take preventative action before any appeared, were included also. For families, they suggested ways to extend the life of and future-proof children's garments, how to adapt regular clothes into maternity wear, and how to make basic baby clothes from adult sleepwear. Throughout the leaflets, there were suggestions of ways to reuse existing materials, and alternative materials to use that required fewer or no coupons. The government was careful to acknowledge that times were hard, but tried to set the tone of the Make, Do, Amend campaign as a call to action as part of a united war effort. I think it's fair to say that many, if not most, people resented a lot of the official communication coming from the Board of Trade, but the advice being distributed would have been pretty useful to a lot of people. There was a real focus on community and joining or even starting groups in your local area. MDAM groups and classes sprung up all over the country. Their aim was to share expertise on how to go about mending and reworking damaged or worn out clothes. Life would have been really tough for many during these years, and everyone would have been carrying their own fears, and I imagine that these groups must have been a much needed source of camaraderie and joy for those attending. I'm going to go into some of the information shared during the campaign in a later episode, so let's instead attempt to answer another burning question. What was going on with home dressmaking during this time? It wasn't all patching up and darning existing garments. There was a lot of garment making happening too. Making clothes was cheaper than buying new mass-produced clothing, and the fabric required to make a similar type of garment would have required fewer coupons, if you could find any fabric to buy. So there was some making from new fabric taking place, but fabric was also harvested from older unused clothes. Making women's skirts or children's garments from suits left behind by men who'd gone overseas was widely documented, for example. And when new fabric was scarce and existing garments were insufficient, many turned to alternative, less likely sources for their projects. A fabric that didn't require coupons and was easier to get hold of was blackout curtaining that was used for blocking out the light from windows so as not to attract the attention of enemy bombers. Some tenacious sewers attempted to make garments such as coats from this. And there are examples of garments sewn from furnishing fabric, blankets and butter muslin usually used in food production. As the war went on and developed, the various materials required subsequently shifted, and occasional surpluses became available. Parachute silk became a great source of fabric for making blouses and sometimes wedding dresses. And in 1945, a surplus of printed silk escape maps that were issued to Allied aircrew were sold off, and often used to make underwear and blouses. But even if sufficient materials had been sourced and clothing items were being made by hand, from what I understand, there would have been real pressure to produce fairly subdued items. Anything too abundant or flamboyant would have appeared show-offy, and possibly even unpatriotic, because this time everyone was just knuckling down and trying to get by with the shortages as best they could. Many were suffering genuine hardship and sacrifice, so full skirts and ruffles would probably have been viewed as being in bad taste. Which is not to say there was no fun or self-expression at all to be enjoyed in dressing during this time. Although everyday outfits would have usually been pretty basic, brightly patterned scarves, often printed with comical and patriotic illustrations, were embraced when available. And some items escaped rationing, like hats, which people wore most of the time outside the home, and decorative items like feathers, though some people went to town creating their own designs to perk up their look. Accessories generally held a higher level of importance in an outfit than they do today. And many people took to crafting their own accessories and even jewellery to create some diversity in their everyday dressing. Patterns for knitting and crocheting jewellery, bags, collars and cuffs appeared to aid these endeavours. So finally, let's get back to the point made at the beginning about the unprecedented government intervention entering everyday lives. So aside from trying to mitigate the impact of the shortages, why was the government placing so much emphasis on what regular people wore? And why did they expend so much effort on the topic? I mean, it could be viewed that they had other bigger fish to fry. Outside of the uniforms related to official duty, keeping people and families clothed has, of course, long been viewed as a largely female concern, and therefore not regarded to have much importance. But in part, it can be explained like this. There had been a genuine concern in the government that if standards of appearance slipped, it might be seen as a sign of, or perhaps even a cause of, low morale. Keeping the population well-dressed would be signalling overall success and unity in the face of the enemy. And the whole thing is deeply infused with a plucky spirit and a stiff upper lip mentality that feels so stereotypically British. But it's fascinating to me how traditionally female activities and skills, such as darning and laundering, were elevated in status, at least for a brief period of history. Those skills were being disseminated across the country by the government and clearly regarded as important in the fight for victory that was happening on all levels and in many areas. So I hope you found this look into the historical and social context of the MDAM campaign interesting. Remember, there's more instalments of this miniseries on their way. Thanks so much for listening. I really hope you enjoyed this episode and are left feeling inspired. For more info about the podcast, including show notes for this and every episode, head to checkyourthread.com. I'd love to hear from you, so if you have any comments, questions or ideas for future episodes, please get in touch by emailing zoe@checkyourthread.com or find me on Instagram @checkyourthread. Massive thanks to Patrick Potter for production support, to Sylvia Seller for the awesome logo design, and to Simon at Palm Skin Productions for the music. This ad-free podcast would not be possible without listener support, so if you feel you are able, please consider signing up to the Check Your Thread Patreon. For the equivalent of buying me a coffee each month, you'll be making it possible to continue producing regular episodes. Links can be found in the show notes and on the website checkyourthread.com. I hope you'll listen again next week. Until then, take care. Bye!